All right, Doxology, good morning. You guys okay? Good to see you guys. Hey, to those of you that are joining us online today, I tell you what, spring forward and spring break and quarantine. It's great to have all of you online. I tell you, I think some people read my email, so that's good. If I'd have known you were going to pay that much attention, I'd have put something in there about the offering. No, I'm just playing. Great to have you guys joining us online. We miss you. It's not the same without you, but travel safely or stay safe, however you do that. Thanks for not showing up if you're not feeling well. Great to have you guys here. Grab a Bible today and meet me in Mark chapter 8. Mark chapter 8 is on page 688 of the Bibles that look like this one. If you need one of those to borrow or to keep, Mark chapter 8 is where we're going to be today. We're in week 4 of a series that we've called the Unanswered Questions of Jesus. If you're just joining us in the series, what we've said all the way along is Jesus asked a ton of questions. Over the course of his 3.5 years of ministry here on the earth, Jesus asked nearly twice as many direct questions as he answered. And it's because Jesus knew something that we've come to realize. It's that in our most important relationships, the very best questions aren't just a quest for information. They're always invitation in relationship. Invitations for us to define something about the identity of a relationship, or to declare something about the nature of a relationship, and sometimes to define some next steps for us to take in a relationship, whatever that is. And we as adults know that in our most important relationships all the time. But have you noticed kids are really good at that? Remember kids, or some of you have grandkids, they ask a ton of questions, especially young kids. And most of the time you realize it's not really just because they're hungry for information. It's that they're hungry for conversation. It's about the relationship. That's why we ask so many questions. And over the course of his ministry, some of the eyewitnesses, the guys that wrote down the story of Jesus as eyewitnesses for us to see, they realized that a lot of Jesus' biggest questions weren't just questions that Jesus asked of a particular person at a particular time. They were that. But these eyewitnesses, Matthew and John, and Mark says Peter, and Luke collected a whole bunch of eyewitnesses that said, I realized even when Jesus asked the question, it wasn't just a good question for that guy. It was a question I needed to answer too. And they wrote it down to send forward to us because they realize that all of us have these invitations from Jesus to define something about the nature of our relationship with him, to declare something about who we believe he is and who we believe we are, and to determine some next steps in our life we take in relationship with him. Where do we go from a place like this? Unanswered questions of Jesus. Today we're continuing the journey in Mark chapter 8. Before we get there, I feel like I need to let you in on the kind of something that happens in my brain behind the curtain of my life. It's a little bit of an uncomfortable thing to let you know about, but many of you know, about 15 years ago, I went through a pretty significant health thing. I went undiagnosed and misdiagnosed for several weeks and has some long-lasting kind of side effects. Some of them you can see, some of them you don't necessarily know about. The part that you can see, and some of you have noticed this, like there's part of my face that's weaker than the other side of my face. If you haven't noticed that before, you'll spend the next 35 minutes looking at it on a larger-than-life LED screen. And I should have thought about that before I brought it out, but here we are. So that's part of it. That's part of it that you can see. It's part of the reason that if you're standing on the right side of my head, I'll kind of turn my head so I can hear you out of my left ear, just part of the long-lasting effects of an undiagnosed, misdiagnosed health thing that happened several years ago for me. That's the part that you can see and notice. There's part of it that you wouldn't see or notice if I didn't tell you that happens. And if you've ever had like a health thing that went misdiagnosed or undiagnosed for a really long time, you kind of know this. This is probably true of you. But there's something about that experience that can turn a person into a mild hypochondriac. So some of you have experienced this, okay? For me, it's nothing clinical, and I sure wouldn't make light of anybody that's got like a clinical hypochondria, but it's a real thing in my life, and it's a real thing in a part of my story, and some of you too. All it takes is the naming of a symptom for me to feel the symptom. Some of you have that? So the truth is, like pharmaceutical commercials, ambulance chasing lawyer commercials, they're a particular kind of torture for me. You ever notice, like they start listing through the symptoms, and all of the symptoms are so normal. They say, if you or someone you love ever experiences shortness of breath, and I sit there and watch the commercial and think, just yesterday at the gym, I was short of breath. If you or a loved one's ever felt dizzy, I think, gosh, is the room spinning? If you experience a persistent cough, by the time it gets to the end of the commercial, like it gives the number to call, and I'm trying to figure out, should I call the number or should I call Carrie and tell her that I'm dying? And God help us when the stomach flu comes to our house. Just wander around the house spraying everything with Lysol and anointing everything with Purell. I bathe in the stuff. And all the while I'm walking around the house going, is my stomach hurting? I don't feel good. I think I'm sick. I think I got the stomach flu. I got to lay down. So this whole week, we've been looking at coronavirus, trying to make sure that we're leading well through it as a church, prepared well, paying attention, don't overreact, don't underreact. And it's allergy season in Texas, so you can imagine what kind of week I've had, reading all the symptoms, and struggling with allergies. Anybody else have a little bit of mild hypochondria? I wouldn't ask you to out yourself in front of the whole church. Anybody married to somebody who has mild hypochondria? So here's what I want to do today. Misery loves company. So that's the kind of world that I live in. Here's what I want to do for you. This morning I want to point out something spiritual. A spiritual disease that I'm pretty convinced most of us have. In fact, I'm sure I have it. And you probably need to know about it because it's serious. It's chronic. It has long-lasting side effects. It's debilitating. It's potentially fatal. My goal for you today is to help you recognize the symptoms to convince you that you've got it. Sound good? But I don't just want to convince you that you've got it. I want to show you the treatment because the treatment is relatively simple for a pretty serious disease. Here's the disease. You can go ahead and write it down. It's called cardiomyopathic amnesia. You can write it down. Cardiomyopathic amnesia. And again, I think you've got it. I'm certain I've got it. How do you know if you've got it? Well, I could list off all of the symptoms for you, but I'd rather let Jesus do it. And he does. Mark chapter 8, beginning at verse 17. We've listed one unanswered question of Jesus on your worship guide this morning. Really, Jesus asks 8 rapid-fire questions to the people that are following him, and several of them ask them about the symptoms of cardiomyopathic amnesia, to ask them if they've got it and help them self-diagnose. And I want you to do that this morning as well. Look with me, Mark chapter 8, beginning of verse 17. Jesus says, "Are your hearts hardened? Do you have eyes but fail to see? Ears that fail to hear? And don't you remember? If you or a loved one suffer from any of these symptoms, call today. You might have cardiomyopathic amnesia." What is cardiomyopathic amnesia? Well, let's break it down. Cardio talks about your heart. Mal is a prefix that means bad. Audio refers to your, and what's an ophthalmologist? Talks about your eyes. Cardiomyopathic amnesia is a disease of the heart that has a negative effect on your eyes and your ears and your spiritual memory. And the unanswered question of Jesus for us today is simple. Do you have it? Well, how in the world would I know? Well, actually, in order to understand his unanswered question, we have to go back in the story a couple of chapters. This diagnosis is at the end of a whole section that's all tied together, and that kind of presents me with a problem because it starts in Mark chapter 6 and goes all the way through Mark chapter 7 and Mark chapter 8 and really to the end of the Gospel of Mark. But unless you want to skip lunch today, we can't go back and look at all of it in depth and unpack all of it together. And yet, if you don't understand the context of the question, you can't get the full effect of the disease. It would be a little like saying, once upon a time, the third bowl of porridge was just right, so she laid down and went to sleep. If you just get part of the story, you miss the point of the story. So here's what I want to do today. Flip back to Mark chapter 6 in your Bible if you've got it. Just one page in my Bible, not even maybe that much in your Bible. Mark chapter 6, look at verse 6. You see a heading there? Mark chapter 6, my Bible, it says, Jesus sends out the 12. Do you see that? Okay, that represents a major transition point in the book of Mark. Mark shows us, beginning there in Mark chapter 6, verse 6, as Jesus moves from just talking to crowds to developing the 12, the people that are following him. He's trying to change them from just being spectators of what he's doing into being participants of what he's come to do. And his first lesson right off the bat is to teach them about dependence on him. He sends them out and tells them what not to take, so that they'd find themselves completely dependent on him with every step that they take of following him from this point on. Then you see a heading, just look at the very next heading after that one. It says, John the Baptist beheaded. If you were to read through that section, what you would find is King Herod throws a birthday party for himself. And the whole point of the story, the whole point of the party that Herod shows or celebrates is to show the whole world how powerful he is and how wealthy he is, to show off his power and his wealth and his family for everybody else to see. The disciples are traveling around in a way that shows their dependence on Jesus, and Herod throws a party to show the rest of the world that he doesn't have to depend on anybody because he brings plenty to the table. Then in the story, you go back to the disciples, the heading that says Jesus feeds the 5,000. You see that? You're probably familiar with that story. The disciples come back from the journey Jesus sent them on, and Jesus asks them how it goes, and they report to him, Jesus, it was awesome. And in fact, we don't want to brag, but Jesus, we're pretty awesome too. You see all of these people that are following behind us and coming to you. You know why? It's because of us, because we're awesome and we're hungry. So Jesus says to them, well, you must be tired from all of that awesomeness. And if you're really that hungry, let's go away to a quiet place and rest together and get you guys something to eat. So they get in a boat to go away for dinner. But the crowd follows them along the shore, and the solitary place isn't solitary anymore, and they are still hungry. So they say to Jesus, let's send the crowds away. Let's send them to go get something to eat because, Jesus, they're probably hungry. Jesus says, you guys feed them. So they do some calculations. There are 5,000 men. We haven't even started to count their wives and their children. We've checked ways. We know where the nearest grocery store is. We've done a budget. Jesus, we can't do what you're calling us to do. So Jesus says, well, what can you do? What do you have? I say, well, not enough. We've got 5 saltines and 2 sardines. Jesus says, 5 saltines? Why 5 saltines? Don't those come in packs of 2? Peter's standing over in the corner looking guilty. Jesus takes what they put in his hand. He gives thanks for it. They begin to distribute it to the crowd, and everybody eats till they're satisfied. And the disciples each get a basket of leftovers, 12 baskets full of leftovers. They each get a take-home box. The next heading says Jesus walks on water. Mark says immediately after the feeding of the 5,000, Jesus puts the guys on a boat. And he says, I'm going to go back and dismiss the crowd. You guys go to the other side of the lake, and I'll catch up with you before too long. And they start rowing into a headwind. You ever feel like your whole life is rowing into a headwind? Mark says later that night, it should have taken them just a matter of minutes to row across the boat. But later that night, Jesus is still on the shore, and he looks out and he can see them from the shore. They're not even out of eyesight yet, rowing against the wind. And he sees that they're straining against the oars. They're putting all of their effort into getting the place that Jesus has called them to go. They're not making any progress, straining against the oars. So Jesus sets out across the lake. You know the story. He walks on the water effortlessly. And he's intending to go past them, and they're terrified, and they cry out. And Jesus gets on the boat and calms the wind and helps them get across. And Mark says they were shocked. You know why they were shocked? Mark tells us. Look at Mark chapter 6, verse 52. They were shocked, for they had not understood about the loaves. Their hearts were hardened. Mark says the stories are connected. They were straining at the oars and shocked by Jesus because they didn't understand the thing about the saltines. If you're reading the story, you may be like the disciples. Understand the thing about the saltines? I'm not sure I understand the thing about the saltines. What's the connection between hungry disciples and straining against the oars, rowing into a headwind? Well, keep looking. There's a heading that says, that which defiles. They encounter a group of people called the Pharisees. Pharisees were people who were obsessed with how to make God happy and keep God happy. They were the masters of the do's and don'ts. They prided themselves in how much they stayed inside the lines, how little they strayed, how well they obeyed. Jesus says, you guys have let go of the commands of God and are holding on to human traditions. Like, fellas, you've developed a whole religion that doesn't depend on God to follow God. I wonder if you've got a system of religion that doesn't need God to follow God. Then Jesus heals a Syrophoenician woman who it turns out is the exact opposite of the Pharisees. She's a spiritual outsider. She's a beggar who has nothing and needs everything. And she finds herself begging Jesus for, don't miss this, a crumb of bread from the table. Like just the salt from the saltine. And Jesus looks at her and listens to her and looks at the disciples and said, more of this. Then he heals a guy who can't hear and can't speak, that hears Jesus' promise and can't stop talking about it. That brings us to Mark chapter 8. Look at Mark chapter 8, verse 1. Mark's recording the story. He says, during those days, that's important, another crowd gathered. Okay, so the previous stories aren't ancient history. They're current events. They've just happened. We're in the same days, and another crowd gathers. Since they had nothing to eat, Jesus called his disciples to him and said, I have compassion for these people. They've already been with me 3 days and have nothing to eat. If I send them home hungry, they'll collapse on the way because some of them have come a long distance. Fellas, there's a huge crowd and they're hungry. What are we going to do? Are you tracking? Look what they say. Verse 4, disciples answered, but where? In this remote place, can anyone get enough bread to feed them? Jesus, we've done the calculations. 4,000 men. We haven't even started to count the women and children. We've checked where the closest grocery store is on Waze. We've run the budget. Jesus, we can't do what you're calling us to do. Jesus says, verse 5, how many saltines do you have? 7, they replied. 7? How are there 7? Don't those things come in packs of 2? Peter's over in the corner looking guilty. Verse 6, he told the crowd to sit down on the ground. When he'd taken the 7 loaves, given thanks, he broke them, and he gave them to his disciples to distribute among the people, and they did so. Okay, quick thought. Realize the same thing happened back in chapter 6. You notice Jesus is 3,993 saltines short of what he needs for the crowd, even just to have a bite. And both times the miracle starts with Jesus giving thanks when everybody knows that Jesus doesn't have what Jesus needs to get what Jesus wants to do done. He's given thanks for what everybody knows isn't even close to enough. That's for somebody today. Thinks that Jesus is disappointed and not grateful for what he's given you to bring to the table. Look at verse 7. Keep reading. They had a few small fish as well. He gave thanks for them also. He told the disciples to distribute them. The people ate and were satisfied. Don't you feel like you're missing something between verse 7 and 8? Like they brought a few saltines, a few sardines, and Jesus said thanks, and then they distribute them. The people eat and they're satisfied. It doesn't tell us how. Don't you wonder how? Like, did Jesus just say, okay, everybody bow your head? And he gave thanks for the saltines and the sardines, and when everybody opened their eyes, there was a whole buffet right in front of them of bread and fish for everybody? Or did Jesus just take the 7 saltines and break them into little pieces, just enough for each of the guys to have one saltine, like 0.58 saltines, in a little basket that they carried out to the people that were sitting down in groups and said, hey, who's hungry? Like, who's really hungry? Like, who's not walking out of here if you don't get a bite? Chew slowly. I got 0.58 of a saltine. Just a teeny little bit of a sardine. And the guy takes it and eats it. Says, I don't know if you noticed, there's another little piece in there. And give it to somebody else. Over and over and over, the saltines and the sardines just kept magically appearing in the bottom of the basket. We don't know how. How did it happen? It doesn't tell us how. But at the end of the day, there are 7 baskets of saltines and sardines left over. And immediately, Mark tells us they get back in the boat and they go to the other side. Are you seeing a pattern emerging in the stories? It's hard to miss the parallels. And they find the Pharisees again. The Pharisees say, Jesus, put on a performance for us. Show us a sign from heaven. If you want to be accepted by us and approved of through us, you need to pass our test, Jesus. And Jesus says, no sign for you. Come back next year. They get back in the boat. They go back to the other side. Look at verse 14. The disciples had forgotten to bring bread. There's a crowd of 12 with no bread, and they're hungry. And some of you that are parents or teachers, you know that moment with your kids where you can see what they're thinking. You know what they're about to say, and it's happening in slow motion. You just want to say, no, don't say it. And they're in the boat. The disciples are hungry, and they've forgotten to bring bread. And Jesus says, no, don't say it. Verse 14, be careful. Jesus warned them, watch out for the yeast of the Pharisees and of Herod. You know what yeast is? Yeast is a fungus. It's a decomposer. It transforms sugar into carbon dioxide and alcohol. It's how you get alcohol in wine and beer, through yeast. It's how you get air pockets in bread. Make it puff up. And if you've ever seen it work, you know it just takes a little bit and it multiplies and it spreads and it takes over everything. It's small, but it multiplies and it's powerful. The fungus, like a bacteria or a virus. Jesus says, beware the yeast of the Pharisees and of Herod, which are 2 guys that have nothing in common in virtually every story. Herod was a wicked, immoral, political leader. The Pharisees were respected, religious, who had literally taken morality to a whole new level. The world saw them as polar opposites. Jesus saw them as the same. The Pharisees had this thing growing inside of them where they believed that they brought most of what they needed to the table. They obeyed God, they kept the rules, so they expected that God would always work on their terms. Herod had this thing growing inside of him where he believed he brought most of what he needed to the table. He didn't look to his knowledge or his morality. He looked to his politics and his power and assumed it was enough to do everything he needed to do. Jesus says not only are they like each other, They have the same disease. And be careful, disciples. Be careful, follower of Jesus, because what they have is contagious. So be careful. Be vigilant. Wash your hands. Don't touch your face or your eyes. Wear a mask if you have to. And they reply, Jesus says, be careful. Verse 16, they discussed it with one another, and they said, it's because we have no bread. They discussed it with one another, and they decided that Jesus is annoyed with them for bringing too little to the table. Look at verse 17. Aware, notice not involved in this, aware of this discussion. Jesus asked them, why are you talking about having no bread? Do you still not see or understand? Are your hearts hardened? Do you have eyes but fail to see? Ears but fail to hear? And don't you remember? When I broke the 5 loaves for the 5,000, how many basketful of pieces did you pick up? 12, they replied. And when I broke the 7 loaves for the 4,000, how many basketfuls of pieces did you pick up? They said, 7. He said, do you still not understand? What do they not understand? Our God is really good at overcoming our can'ts. Our God is really good at overcoming our can'ts. God has never been limited by what we can't do with what little we bring to the table. And yet so many of us live life like He is. And frankly, that's the reason that so many of us are so bored with the Christian life, following Jesus. It's why so many of us feel so defeated with the Christian life and following Jesus. And it's why some of us are so arrogant in the Christian life, following Jesus. Either we live arrogantly, like Jesus is pretty lucky to be able to trust in somebody like us to do what He wants done in a world like this. We live defeated because we realize we can't do what Jesus wants done. We're just bored with it all. Because we stay on the sidelines, we never stop to step into moments that require the person or the power of Jesus. Somewhere along the way, we decided we're only going to be willing to follow Jesus and the things we're able to do without Him. Do you understand? 3 chapters of this, and it actually goes on. We don't have time to go all the way to the end, to the Feast of Unleavened Bread, where a woman pours out everything she has on Jesus, and Jesus says she did what she could. I'll take it from here. To the night before He was crucified, where Jesus breaks bread and passes it out to the disciples and says, this is my body. From here on out, I'm going to be with you and within you, and you will never, ever, ever be without bread because of who I am. Over and over and over, Mark is saying, this is what it looks like to follow Jesus through life. The life He invites you into begins with an invitation to moments that you're not up to. One of my seminary professors said it this way: you must always do what you cannot do with what you do not have for the rest of your life. And if you don't pay attention, if you're not on your guard, the fungus of self-reliance and self-sufficiency and self-salvation will make itself at home in your life and begin to grow and multiply. Your heart will begin to grow cynical, hopeless, or apathetic. Your eyes, spiritual eyes, will see opportunities from God as nothing more than insurmountable obstacles, the path that He's called you to. Your ears won't hear the invitations of Jesus to simply involve Him. Instead, you'll hear the voice of the enemy amplified over and over, who reminds you who you aren't and what you can't. And you'll forget what Jesus has done in you and near you and with you and through you, even in these recent days. Cardio-maladiophthalic amnesia will steal your joy and sideline your purpose and choke out your hope. Do you have it? Has it been a while since you saw Jesus show who He is through someone like you? Has it been a while since you stood near an opportunity and heard the still small voice of Jesus whisper, "Let's do something together here"? Are your best moments with Jesus memories that are slowly slipping away? Are you bored following Jesus? Defeated following Jesus? Or are you just glad that Jesus has somebody like you to trust in doing what He wants done in your world? Cardio-maladiophthalic amnesia. Is it doing a number on your joy, or your hope, or your purpose? Good news. There's treatment. And it's surprisingly simple, though it's anything but easy. Think back to all the stories. Feeding of the 5,000, straining at the oars against the wind, the feeding of the 4,000 and the bread in the boat. What was Jesus inviting them to do every single time? Here it is. You can write it down. When He calls and you can't, take a step toward "I will" and trust Him. When He calls and you can't, take a step toward "I will" and trust Him. When you know what He wants, feed these people, and you know that you can't. I've got 5 saltines and a couple of sardines. I've got 7 saltines. I didn't remember to bring any saltines. When He calls and you can't, take a step toward "I will" and trust Him. So there's a question for all of us this morning. What's Jesus calling you to do this morning that you know you can't do? Do you know what it is today? If you don't know what it is, that's your first step towards "I will." Simply to ask Him, "Jesus, what are you doing around me that I can't do, that you will do if I give myself to you?" Some of you know immediately what it is. He's called, and you can't. Can I encourage you to take a step toward "I will" this morning and trust Him? He's called you to keep your marriage vow, and you feel like you can't stay in that marriage one more day. Take a step toward "I will" and trust Him. Call a counselor. Show up for re-engage. Change of behavior, sacrifice of preference. Whatever the first step is toward "I will" from here today, take it and trust Him. He calls you towards generosity, and you feel like you can't be generous. Take one step toward "I will" and trust Him with your can'ts. We believe He's called us as a church to see doxology in every single neighborhood of Fort Worth. People who really love Jesus and really love each other, really love their neighbors, within walking distance of people who need people that love like that. And He's called you to be a part of that, to bless your neighbors. And all the way up to this point, you've said, "I can't. I don't have what it takes. You can't do it all, so you haven't done any of it. Is there a next step toward I will that you could take and trust him this week? He's called you to forgive. You can't forgive. To raise kids that you can't figure out how to raise. To solve a social problem, to advocate for people that don't have a voice. To beat an addiction or a temptation, or introduce them to someone that you know and you know that you can't. You don't have what it takes. Can you take a step toward I will and trust him? What's the thing that God is asking you to do that you've said, I can't? I don't have what it takes. I don't bring what you need to the table. Jesus says, don't you see? Don't you hear? Don't you remember? I can't is not a problem for me. All I'm waiting is for a first step towards I will. That's why we end all of our community groups with a chance to make an I will statement together. Even just making the statement is a step toward I will, isn't it? It's a discipline that people like you and me have to keep coming back to because we know that cardiomyopathic amnesia is coming for us. And it starts off small, but it grows and it multiplies. And we want to consistently take steps towards I will to keep our hearts tethered to him, dependent on him, walking with him, so our hearts don't get hard and our ears don't get closed, our eyes don't go dark, and our memories don't go dim. I can't is precisely where Jesus invites us to live. Because we serve a God who is really good at overcoming. I can't. Will you pray with me? I don't know what the I can't thing is in your life this morning. And I know some of us realize that we've got 5 saltines and a few sardines. Some of us have 7. Some of us realize we don't have any. Yet this morning when it comes to Jesus, the question isn't, what do you have? The question is, do you have Jesus? And some of us this morning realize we don't. Like the Pharisees, we've lived like we can. Like that's what he wants. This morning we need to realize that we can't. And I will and trust is all he calls us to. In this moment you may realize that Jesus came to the earth because you couldn't make your life right with God. He died on a cross, rose from the dead to give you life that costs you nothing. And all he asks is for you to just take a step towards I will and trust. And you could take that step in this moment to simply say, Jesus, I believe that you died for me. And you rose from the dead. And I'm trusting you with what I can't do. Lord, for all of us in this moment, that's the story that we live our life by. That's the thing that we walk every single step of our life with. We can't do what you've called us to do. Let us be people who say, I will. Take a step and trust you in every area of our life, with every aspect of our life. Let us be people of I will, who trust you for every single thing that you call us to. We ask it in Jesus' name through his power. Amen.